Oh no, my teen wants to drive. I saw this the other day on Instagram and I thought it was the funniest thing. And I was like, this is so perfect what we're doing. Yeah, this is bollocks. And even while I'm driving safely and following the law. Now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ehsani. Oh,
Thank you, Kristen, and appreciate all of you being here. It's a special opportunity to speak with you all. I'm going to jump right in, and before I do, I just want to give you a little bit about my background and qualifications. Maybe the most important one for you to know is that I have two boys. That's probably the most important thing for parents on this call, because I'm not coming to you necessarily as someone who has all the answers, but as someone who can relate to what it's like to having your kid learning to drive. And so I've got a few slides about driver licensing systems, why they're there, what they're intended to do, and some of the challenges of using them. I studied this under a terrific mentor around 20 years ago, and I've been doing research on the topic of licensing and teen licensing ever since. So without further ado, I'm going to just jump right in. And if you have any questions, I believe Kristen said you typically hold them to the end, but if there's any burning questions, just jump right in. So I'm going to share my screen, and if there's someone who's on camera who can give me a thumbs up that you can see the screen. Terrific. And is it a thank you for that thumbs up, Carrie. And just Carrie, one more favor. Is it the one that's all blue, or is it the one that's like got my slides on the side?
all blue. It's all blue.
Terrific. Okay, terrific. So some of you may or may not have heard of this term before, called graduated driver licensing. But basically, it's what policy people call the progressive process of licensing that your teenager may have already gone through, or is about to go through, or is going through right now. And a little bit about, what I'm going to talk about is why it's there and why it matters. To start off with, I should say that, you as parents have done a remarkable job to raise a teen. You have gotten through the difficult stage of lugging around a heavy car seat and keeping your kids safe. I have kids who have just come out of this age, and every time I remove the car seat from the chair in the car, I'm always shocked by what lurks underneath. I'm sure you can relate. Sometimes I feel like an entire meal could be eaten based on what's underneath my kid's car seat. So you've done a terrific job. You've raised a teenager, and you are about to launch them into adulthood. So this is why licensing matters, because it's a important conduit to employment, to more educational opportunities, to socializing, to getting around. Licensing is part of that process of getting a successful launch as a human being. However, licensing and driving comes with risks. So as some of you may relate to this, as you are teaching your child to drive, just like Kristen was sharing with us earlier, the picture of I believe it was a small mammal, maybe a hamster or a squirrel, I couldn't tell, but it was, mostly parents are, enter the process of teaching their teen to drive with some trepidation. It's scary sitting next to someone who's learning to drive. It's scary when you think that it's your baby who's driving. And so I kind of come to you with humility, saying that I get it, and you've done a terrific job until now, and it's important for you to kind of continue to be vigilant around driving, because it is unfortunately the highest risk for crashing your child is ever going to be. So this is a figure of crashes. Again, this is, the take home message of this figure is that the younger you are when you start driving, the more likely you are to crash. So if an 18-year-old starts driving, their crashes per million kilometers is 30. If a 40-year-old starts driving for the first time, their crashes per million kilometers is around 10. Now, some of your kids are 15, 16, so you can imagine that curve starts even higher. Why are young drivers at elevated risk of crash? It's a function of a lot of things. Every new driver is at elevated risk of crash. It's got something to do with their age, but it's also got to do with their inexperience. And so this slide and the next slide I'm going to show you are to remind you that crashes are a leading cause of death for young people. And unfortunately, since the pandemic, a trend that had been going downwards for the last 10 years has started to tick back up again in terms of the number of young people who are killed in car crashes every year in the United States. And these are data from the CDC. So let me just start by saying, when we look at this slide, that crashes are rare. Crashes where someone is injured or killed are exceedingly rare, but they do happen. Around 2,000 young people each year are killed in crashes. And if there's one thing you remember from this talk, you can forget everything I say about licensing, about the learner permit, about all of that stuff. The one thing you need to remember from this talk is to tell your teenager that they must use their seatbelt every single time they get into the car, either as a driver or as a passenger. When they enter the vehicle, alone or with their friends, the laws of physics do not cease to exist. They continue to exist. For reasons that are not clear to me, when young people get into a car together, they think that seatbelts don't matter. A very tragic crash occurred in Virginia. We're very close to where we live, last week on Monday, the Monday before Thanksgiving. A minivan with 6 teenagers on the way to school crashed when it was going at high speed. The driver, who was impaired, had his seatbelt on. The 5 other teenage occupants in the vehicle, who were all going to the same school, were not wearing seatbelts. And each one of them is fighting for their lives right now. So this is not the domain of people we don't know. It doesn't happen to us. It happened in Virginia, close to where I live, last week. In that case, it was a group of teenagers. Another instance of a school where we have actually done given talks like this and spoken with the PTA and other groups. There was a young man driving on his own. His parents had done, I believe, what they thought was the right thing and given him the safest car possible. He was driving a Volvo XC90, which is like an extremely safe car. But his car left the roadway at high speed. He wasn't wearing a seatbelt and he was ejected from the vehicle and he died. So I'm telling you these stories only to reinforce the point that we can talk about licensing and permits and all kinds of stuff forever. But the ground floor is that your teenager is wearing a seatbelt. So that's all I would recommend. Half of the people who died in crashes in teen driver crashes were unbelted. And so again, I will quiz you at the end. What's the one thing I want you to remember from this talk? Your teen must wear a seatbelt at all times, either as a driver or as a passenger. Now I'm going to start talking about licensing. So, what is graduated driver licensing? It functionally looks like this. You go to the California DMV and you take a knowledge test, and you probably begin driver education a little bit beforehand, and you come out with a learner permit. So tonight I'm not going to talk about driver education. I'm going to talk about the licensing system. And when you get a learner permit, you are required to always have a licensed driver in the vehicle, typically 21 or older. Usually it's mom or dad, an uncle, an aunt, a guardian. Many of you may have already done this. In every state, there's a minimum number of hours you need to practice. And there's usually a period of time you have to hold this learner permit. And the idea, the theoretical idea behind the learner permit is that mastering any motor skill takes some time and practice. You can't just enter a basketball court and start playing a game with 9 other people on the court. You need to practice beforehand. And driving is a little bit like playing basketball. You need to know how to function, how to operate the vehicle, but you also need to know how to interact with the other players on the court. Once you pass your driving test, you get an intermediate license, which is a license to drive on your own. Again, I know many of you know this already, so forgive the kind of the redundant information, but just for the sake of everyone. And this intermediate license has usually certain restrictions. There's often a nighttime driving restriction where you can't drive, usually between, say, 10 p.m. or midnight and 5 a.m. And there are typically limits on the number of people you can have in the vehicle. And there's usually an age before which you can't kind of leave that intermediate license phase. So these are some of the components that, again, you may know about in terms of the licensing system. Now, in California specifically, these are your requirements. I'm sorry, it says Minnesota. I gave this talk in Minnesota 2 weeks ago. I forgot to change the title, but the information here is correct. This is for California. The minimum entry age for the permit is 15.5 months. You have to hold it for 6 months, and you need to practice for 50 hours. And then you get the intermediate license, where there is a nighttime restriction that I just mentioned, and a passenger restriction as well. And so California and Minnesota and Virginia and Washington, D.C. and Maryland, they all have graduated driver licensing laws. In fact, graduated driver licensing laws are one of the most widely adopted road safety policies in the country. Almost every state has some set of requirements. As you can see, most states have 16 as the minimum age for unsupervised driving. And this is a map of when the nighttime restriction begins. So most states here begin at midnight or later. Now, of course, and let me give you the final one, and this is where there's a restriction on passengers. So we saw in the previous figure that California has 0 passengers allowed, and most states allow 1 passenger. And you may be asking yourself, like, where do these ideas come from for restrictions on passengers or nighttime crashes? Well, they came from crash data and epidemiology, where people looking at teen driver crashes around 20 years ago began to notice that, with each additional teen in the vehicle, the risk of crash doubled, basically. And this was particularly the case when there were additional male passengers in the vehicle. So again, I'm not kind of singling out boys for misbehaving, but the epidemiology just suggested that with each additional passenger in the vehicle, severe crashes increased in likelihood. There's all kinds of reasons why this might be the case. simply the amount of noise that might be in the vehicle might be distracting for the driver, let alone any other kinds of encouragement that the driver may be getting for driving in a certain way. So the rationale for these restrictions was based on sound data and science. But then what gets passed depends a little bit on what a legislative assembly could get through in a given legislative session. So some of the requirements that we have for graduated driver licensing are evidence-based, and others are common sense. So this is a kind of complicated looking figure, which basically makes a single point that, some of those things that I mentioned in a few slides previously, like here, like if you think about the learner license holding period as being one component, the number of hours being another component, the passenger restriction being one component, the nighttime driving restriction being another component. If you begin to add up the number of components in a given state and compare the states that have, say, only one component compared to states that might have 4, 5, or 6 components, you begin to notice a really interesting trend, is that the laws which apply, so graduate driver licensing laws apply to 16 and 17-year-olds typically. The more graduated licensing components you have, so 1 to 7, the bigger reductions in fatal crash rates you see over time. So the point here is that strong graduated driver licensing systems, and California has a very strong system, are associated with reductions in the fatal crashes of young people. And this is good news because it shows us that these policies are effective in reducing the worst outcomes. However, you may be asking yourself, well, which components are like the active ingredient? Which ones really, really matter? And so we looked, for example, we took all the states that introduced one component at a time, and we tried to kind of untangle their effects. And the learner license period of time, like the length of time someone has to hold their permit. So I think in California, it's 6 months. In other states, it's typically 12 months, 9 months in Maryland. That is associated with a significant reduction in fatal driver crash rates. So that's when you take the pooled effect of all of these states that introduce that component at a single time point, and you combine them into a model, then there's an association with a significant reduction in crashes. However, and this might be a little bit scandalous for you, what I'm about to tell you, so I hope that this doesn't discourage you from doing what you're meant to be doing, but unfortunately, the pooled effect of the required supervised driving hours was not associated with a reduction in crash rates. So, in California that you have 50 hours of practice you need to accumulate. In Maryland, it's 45. In Virginia, it's 45. And in other states, it goes up to 70 hours. These hours, when you look at them in their totality and their effect on fatal crash rates, they don't have an effect on safety. And I think there's lots of reasons why that might be the case. But one of them is that, many people don't even come close to their state requirement of whatever hours they have. They'll see 50 hours and they'll practice with their son or daughter and say, you know what, I think she was good after 10 hours, and we just left it there. Others might practice the full amount, but they may not give their teen the variety of practice that they need. They're always coming and going from home to school or from home to the supermarket, and they didn't get a lot of variation. And others might just not practice under the conditions where teens are experiencing the greatest risk. So maybe they're not practicing on the highways, or they're not practicing in busy downtown areas because it's scary to practice with someone who is learning to drive under those conditions. So perhaps the takeaway point from this slide is that you should treat your required number of supervised practice driving hours as the ground floor, and that you should really be aiming for much more practice that's high quality and diverse. The only evidence we have of when the number of hours becomes associated with a safety effect comes from studies that have been done in Scandinavia, where the experiment showed that something over 100 hours began to have a safety effect. That study was controversial because it wasn't the best study design, but that's the evidence where, for example, where I come from in Australia, a number of jurisdictions have 100 or 120 hours of practice requirements as part of their licensing requirements. So we're now getting kind of to some of the challenges with graduated driver licensing, which is that one could effectively just watch the clock and let the licensing requirements kind of let the chips fall where they may. Your son or daughter is required to hold their learner permit for 6 months in California. Well, you take the knowledge test, get the permit, and not do anything over those 6 months. Acquire very little practice, because you know what? There's no way for anyone to know how much you actually practiced with them. It's all based largely on an honor system. Police aren't going to enforce it. The Highway Safety Office in the DMV is not going to second guess a parent or guardian who has signed off on their teen, and there's no recourse for them if they do. In the majority of states, graduated driver licensing is applied to 16 and 17-year-olds. Now, some states are raising the age. So, for example, in New Jersey, it applies to an older age group, and a few other states are beginning to lift the age at which people can begin driving. But some people have speculated that because these licensing requirements are only imposed on 16 and 17-year-olds, some people are waiting until age 18 when these requirements are no longer in place. This is unfortunate because the learner stage actually confers some safety benefit that we discussed before, and all new drivers are at higher risk. So even if you start driving at age 18, there's a need for some safety precautions for you, and not just to begin driving the day you get your license. So I'm going to stop there, and I've got a few more slides, but I want to just kind of see how we're doing, check back in with our moderator, and see how, if there's any questions or a need to kind of transition to another speaker.
I'm not seeing any questions. We probably have a couple more minutes for you, and then probably need to transition on, if that's okay.
Sure, that's great. So, okay, so back to sharing then, and I will now kind of share some of my more some of my thinking about where licensing systems are heading in the United States. And I'd love to get your opinions about it as well. Okay, so this is kind of the bit where I get to learn from you. So I'm going to go back to my slides now. Can you see this set of hurdles, Carrie? Okay, great, thanks. All right, terrific. So, having reflected on the limitations of graduated driver licensing, we can think of them as a hurdle that young drivers need to clear. And for some young drivers, having, for example, someone who can supervise them for 50 hours may not be feasible. A parent, in a single parent household, for example, may not have the time to practice 50 hours with their teen. Or there isn't a car available. There's lots of different reasons why some of these graduated driver licensing components might not be practical at a family level. And so an emerging idea in licensing is to move away from a time-based or hour-based requirement to a performance-based requirement. And so you might be asking yourself, well, Johnathon, what on earth is a performance-based licensing system? Well, one iteration of it already exists. It comes in the form of insurance companies giving you a discount when you download an app on your phone and you get a premium discount for driving safely. So every day, 10% of Americans use an app to get an insurance premium discount. That's the idea behind a performance licensing program also, that rather than rely on the kind of the 6 months of learner permit and 12 months of restricted licensure, what if we relied on people's actual driving behavior rather than some time that passes and may or may not result in safer driving behaviors? So we've been thinking about what a performance-based licensing system could look like. We've done some survey work across the country, and we're working with a couple of states to pilot what a performance-based system could look like. And in effect, I think, one of the questions I have for you all today, and I'm going to kind of like change my view of the audience so I can see you all. So can we do a quick test run? Can you all try, like, just anyone who's on the call who's actually in front of a computer, can you try raising your hands for me, just like as an exercise? You know, in Zoom, how you can kind of do the raise hand function. Okay, I see them. Thank you, Stacy and Jacqueline and others. Okay, here we go. Thank you. I got it. Terrific. Perfect. You passed the test. Thank you. All right. So how many of you, so keep your hands up or put your hands up if you're using some sort of driver monitoring technology in your car for the purposes of measuring your teen's driving behavior. So this is something that you would plug in, or it might be on a smartphone, or it could be an app, but it's to measure, for example, how much your teen is practicing or how they're driving. Some people don't think of this app as doing that, but if you have Life 360 as an app, that does have a driver monitoring component to it that you can, sometimes you pay a little bit more for it, but sometimes not. So again, take a minute and raise your hands if you're using any type of monitoring technology for driving. Okay, terrific. Thank you for doing that. And I just am curious. I want to make sure how many people are on the call. Kristen, can you tell me again? Okay, 85. Okay, so we have like 2 people who did out of 85, 2 out of 85. So we're pretty low single-digit percentages. So I'm going to show you the results of a national survey that we did. And so how many people are using driver monitoring devices? So we asked US adults again, so this wasn't for teens, but we found that 10% of the population is currently using a driver monitoring device. And another almost 10% were previously using a driver monitoring device. So that's kind of an interesting, data point that in total, around 20% of people have had some experience with driver monitoring devices. The next question I have for you all is, should driver monitoring be required for licensing? So think of this in a way as kind of the best case scenario, not a big brother scenario where, California Department of Motor Vehicles knows where your teen is at all times, but a way which was privacy sensitive, data secure, performance based, that would allow your teen to have their license provided they stayed within a safety envelope. Let's call it kind of reasonable bounds for safety. Would you be supportive of a licensing system that included driver monitoring? Okay, hands up, please. Wow, I'm so impressed. I'm seeing at least 13, but I saw some hands. I saw some thumbs up as well. So I'm gonna say 15. I'm even gonna take a picture of it because I'm gonna show you this to other people who I speak to. Say, look, American parents are supportive of driver monitoring. Thank you for for endorsing this idea. Let's see what other people said when we did the survey. So let's have a look. And we asked the question slightly differently. So so this is the red and the dark gray. I'm sorry. Treat everything that's red as strongly opposed, and those who strongly support fall into the very dark gray. And maybe let's just focus on the strongly support segments. But around the same, maybe say, for example, in every sample, around 10 or 15% of people strongly supported the idea. And it's around, maybe our sample tonight was slightly higher, that driver monitoring could be required by a state licensing agency. And we asked the question for 16 and 17-year-olds below the age of 25, and for all new drivers regardless of age. And so I think one of the emerging kind of ideas that we're looking at is how driver licensing agencies could evolve to this type of system. So to wrap up, I'm going to ask my final question in the chat. What is the one thing that I want you to remember from this talk? And it's got nothing to do with driver monitoring or seatbelts. Thank you. Please, seatbelts. So if you have any more questions, or if I didn't answer any of your questions, the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety has a terrific landing page on teenagers, including what car to buy for your teen, including used and secondhand cars. If you'd like to get in touch with me, here's my email. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you for remembering the one thing I wanted you to take from this talk. Everything else, you can just file it for later. And thank you, Kristen. Over to you.
Thank you so much. And sorry about my Wi-Fi at the beginning and not doing your whole bio, but I think I'm in a room now that works. I'm going to move on to Corporal Mike Sanchez, who is from our own South Pasadena Police Department. He has been in the South Pasadena Police Department since 2007. He was the South Pasadena Officer of the Year and received the first of 5 Mothers Against Drunk Driving Awards for recognition of DUI enforcement in 2013. He was certified as a field training officer. In February 2015, Mike was assigned to the Detective Bureau. He was promoted to corporal in August of 2015 and began collateral duties as acting watch commander. He was assigned as a supervisor of the department's newly created traffic division in October 2020. I don't know if you guys knew about that. I didn't. And currently serves in that capacity. He is also the co-founder of the South Pasadena Citizen Academy. I am going to bring up his slides and turn it over to him. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. So the scope of my presentation is going to be on what we see in the police department. It's very easy for police officers to be skeptical because we typically see the worst behaviors. We don't pull people over for driving safely and give them an encouragement for doing so. We're pulling over people who are violating traffic laws. So the scope of my presentation is going to be the trends that we see, the common violations we see as related to teenagers driving, specifically in the city of South Pasadena. So we can go to the first slide. So as Dr. Ehsani discussed about the provisional licensing, this is just a recap of what those restrictions are here in the state. And so what we are seeing is teens in violation of these frequently. This is not an infrequent event. This is very frequent, where we see them driving between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. in violation of their provisions. We see them driving with passengers in violation of their provisions. And a lot of the reason for that seems to be misunderstanding. So if you go to the next slide, it talks about the exemptions to the restrictions. And just like many of the laws, there's always exemptions, and this is no different. So there are exemptions to the restrictions of driving between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m. And there are exemptions to driving with passengers. However, As it says there in bold, the law requires that the driver must carry a signed note explaining why you must drive and when the necessity will end. And 10 times out of 10, they do not have that when they're violating their provisions. The next slide, please. These are the exemptions. As you can see there, the medical necessity, school or school authorized activities, employment necessity, or an immediate need of a family member. So there are exemptions, and most of the time that we stop someone who is violating their provisions, they always seem to have a reason why they're doing it. Oh, you know, I have to take my sibling. It's because I got out of work at midnight, because it's, you know, retail hours, because we're in the holiday season, and which is fine, which they can, but they need to have that note signed. And so we're seeing 10 times out of 10, they don't have that note. They don't have the proper permission to be violating their provisions. These are exemptions. These are not rules. So you should not make it a habit to always allow, you know, your teen driver to drive their younger sibling to school because you have to go to work. It's just not a good idea. As Dr. Ehsani took the time to explain the reasons why there are the restrictions in the first 12 months of licensure, it's for safety reasons. It's because their studies have shown that accidents increase when young drivers, inexperienced drivers are distracted. And so speaking of distractions, if we can go to the next slide. Cell phones. It's very rare in 2023 to see someone driving around with a phone up to their ear. It does happen, but it's very rare. It's been a long time since I've seen a teen driver doing that. However, it's very common for us to catch them holding their phone while they're driving. And the number one thing that they tell us is, well, I wasn't texting. And that doesn't matter if you weren't texting. The law is very clear. You can't hold a cell phone or other electronic communication device while driving. And so it has to be mounted in the car. But that big however there in the middle of the screen, drivers under 18 are not allowed to use their cell phones or other wireless communication devices while driving. They can use the GPS in the car. They can use the GPS on their phone. They just cannot touch it while they're driving. So they have to make all their address stops all while parked on private property, and they can't not touch their cell phones unless the car is off and parked. So that's a common mistake that we see, and we see it very frequently. So please, for adults and for teenagers, but especially teenagers, because they're more easily distracted while driving with their phones. They're not allowed to use it under 18 for any reason unless it's an emergency. So that's one of the big issues that we see when we're stopping drivers who are teens. The next slide is speed. So for whatever reason, once the driver has passed their provisions and they're between the age of 17 and 18, 18-year-old, 19-year-old, 20-year-old, they are over the speed limit very frequently. So again, we don't pull over everyone who's a teen who's driving. The ones we pull over are the ones who are in violation of the vehicle code. And so this is one of the very common violations that we are observing, and it's a very dangerous trend. Driving over the speed limit at any speed which endangers the safety of people or property is inherently dangerous. People can be seriously injured. People can be killed. We've seen it happen here. Part of my responsibilities as the traffic supervisor is to investigate fatalities that arise from traffic crashes in our city. And so we do see it happen. And it is one of the most easiest ways for a teen driver to seriously injure or kill someone is by going over the speed limit. The picture there is from Marengo Avenue. All the schools in the city have a speed limit of 15 miles per hour when children are present. From my days of learning to drive, it was 25. But this is a more recent law, which many people are not aware of, and so we're frequently stopping teen drivers and adult drivers going 35 when they should be driving 15. So be very cognizant around the schools when children are present. You know, it's very easy to see because the streets are packed. Very hard to get up to that speed, but you'd be surprised how people are able to do it because they got a clear way because someone had to stop for the crossing guard or whatever the reason may be, but they're able to get up to those speeds. So please remind your teams that, 15 around the schools. And, when you take your driving exam and you go 1 mile per hour over the speed limit, it's an instant fail. They make you go back to the DMV, and how quickly they forget because they're driving way above the speed limit. It's one of the most common violations we see for teen drivers, especially when they've just exited the provisional stage of their permit, so 17 years old. One of the things we wanted to point out also is that, especially now that we're entering months with inclement weather, if you have your windshield wipers on because of rain or fog, you need to have your headlights on. It's part of the rules there, and that's something that we see that's very infrequently happening. A lot of people depend on the automatic lights in their car, and they're not programmed to go on when your wipers are on. So this is a California specific law, and I believe that may be the reason why. And if we go to the next slide, California has a zero tolerance DUI law, meaning that a driver under 21 cannot have a blood alcohol concentration of 0.01. And we do see it. And it's very rare that we make arrests for this section. Typically, it's the B section of this vehicle code, which says their limit is above the 0.08 presumptive impaired driving. So it does happen. We've pulled over 16, 17-year-olds who are under the influence, clearly way above the 0.01, above the 0.08, and it does happen. So some of the things that we want to bring to your attention is that there's alternative sources of alcohol. They're not typically taken to be under the influence, but it can cause their BAC to be at 0.01 or higher, and that's through cough syrup, topical mouth numbing ointments, or homeopathic medicines. So it's not a good idea to have your teen driving if they're sick and they're taking any of these things, NyQuil, any kind of homeopathic medicines that has fermented, fruits or vegetables that could have alcohol in it, because it's a zero tolerance DUI law in the state. And so one of the most important things that I like to share with the teen drivers and with the parents is that speeding and driving under the influence of alcohol is inherently dangerous. And if your teen driver is cited for driving over the speed limit, or cited for driving under the influence, or watches this presentation or a similar presentation at school, they could be charged with second-degree murder in the state of California, because it's considered a premeditated act. When you know that driving over the speed limit is dangerous, driving under the influence is dangerous, and you do so, and you were to injure or kill someone, then they can be charged with murder in those cases where they kill someone driving over the speed limit or driving under the influence. So something to be taken very seriously. I have seen it charged in our own cases. We're working a case right now where the person is probably going to be charged with murder because they were driving over the influence and over the speed limit under the influence. So it's a very serious matter. Please, 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 wear seatbelts. Do not drive over the speed limit. Do not drive under the influence. It's just a quick way to ruin your life. And that's the end of my presentation. If there are any questions, I do have time now, or if you want to save them to the end, that's fine as well. I'll be on till the end of the call.
Yeah, I am going to save them till the end if that's okay. Now I'm going to move on to Principal Eldred. He's just going to give us a few tips about, where to park around school and any school-related driving stuff. Thank you so much, Principal Eldred.
You're welcome. So the short answer is there's not a lot of parking around school. There's about 20 spaces that are available to students through a lottery that ASB puts together. Some of those spaces are in the main parking lot. The rest are behind the pool. And that is the extent of parking for students on campus. I highly suggest that people walk, take public transportation, ride a bike, do something that's healthy for you, because looking for a parking space at 8:30 in the morning is nothing but stressful and probably not very healthy for you. Beyond that, we don't really have a lot of student drivers, to be honest, on campus. I came from a campus where just about everybody drove, and we had a lot of issues with student speeding, like the officer was just talking about, and other accidents that inherently happen when kids drive too fast around a school community. But I don't have any of that, which is fantastic. So as far as driving goes at South Pasadena High School, that pretty much wraps up my presentation.
Thank you so much, John.
You bet.
Okay, so now I'm going to take over and just get my little slides back up here. So this is the part where parents get really frustrated because, and I know because I went through it twice already, and I was trying to remember even coming up with this for our presentation, what you need to go with to get a license. So you have to take and pass driver's training. You have to do all these different steps. I'm just going to go through them one at a time, try and do this quickly because we're running out of time. So the driver training requirement is 25 hours of classroom instruction. You can do it in person or online. Most people do it online because it's way easier to do online. And you can start at any age, which is wild. So if your kid was 12 and wanted to start it, I guess they could. I don't know why they would. But they recommend, I found many sites that recommended you don't start until you're at least 15. If you have a kid like one of my kids who wants to get their permit on their 15-and-a-half birthday, I recommend that you do start early, because what you have to do is you have to get this pink slip that comes from them, which I'll show you in a second. How to find a company. There are so many out there. It's amazing. The recommendations I got is Google. Go on Groupon. Somebody said they found one as low as $12 on Groupon, which was kind of amazing. Ask other parents what they used, or the DMV website also has a lot of suggestions as well. I can't even remember which schools my older kids used. I think they both used different ones because we just really Googled something and found a cheap one, and they did that one. They're all pretty fine. You also can, this is kind of a random one, but SPEF over summer school has one where you can send your kid, it's like a half class where you can send them and they go to do the online portion. You pay SPEF to basically have them sit in a classroom and have time to get it done. Because honestly, if your kid's doing it at home, it's one of those where you're like, have you done it? Have you done it? Have you done it? Have you done it? And they really don't want to do it because it's like going back to online school again. So SPEF does have a thing if you want your kid to just do it over summer, and they might have a sport in the afternoon and they have nothing to do in the morning. It's a great way to get them out of the house and have someone sit there. The teacher doesn't really help them much. They can answer questions, but it's a lot of work on your own. So kind of an interesting one. And like I said, at the end, you're going to get this pink slip. So you have to have this pink slip to say that you graduated and passed the test, which you'll pass. They basically make it pretty easy for you to pass on all of these. But you have to have this to take to the DMV to get your permit. So then you have your license application, permit test, and a DMV trip. So you can both start your application and do your knowledge test online at the California DMV website. They just started the ability to do the test online. You used to have to actually go to the DMV. You're still going to have to go to the DMV, but there's something kind of nice that you can do it at home. Your student can do it at home online without the pressure of being in a room. When you do the license application on the California DMV website, make sure you have a social security number handy. You'll need that. It's recommended you get a real ID, as you can use it at airports nationally as your ID. I think you're pretty much, I've decided in talking with other parents, you're pretty much going to get a real ID anyway, because all the documents you need to prove that you're the parent of this child are pretty much the same ones as what you get a real ID for. Permit test info. There are 46 questions. You can miss 8. If you don't pass, you can try to retake the test again in 7 days. Once you do pass the test, make an appointment online to get your permit at the local DMV. Also, I recommend, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, make an appointment with a driving school at this same time. We had the mistake of my kid got a permit and then they couldn't get the driving school for like a month, which was just crazy. Oh, it says cute little animations. Okay, your DMV trip. So you must finish the application in person, and you want to bring with you the following. It's one proof of identity, a document like a birth certificate. Now, if your For example, like me, I'm the mom. The birth certificate, I don't know why, only has my maiden name on it. It doesn't have my married name on it, but my name is Kristen Swift. But my maiden name is Kristen McKittrick, and it has my maiden name. So I also had to bring a marriage certificate with me to prove that this was my child and that I was actually Kristen Swift and used to be Kristen McKittrick. So it's super frustrating. I'd say if you're questioning what you need to bring more than you think you need to bring, because it's very confusing. But just that was my big thing that almost messed me up. You do need 2 different printed documents to show the parent or guardian California mailing address with your name on it. So home utility bill, medical bill, lease agreement. They just need to see you are who you are and you live where you live. At the appointment, your teen will need to show these identity docs, take a vision exam, pay a $41 fee, take a photo, and give a fingerprint. So just be ready for all of that. So congratulations, now your teen has a permit. That's kind of exciting and kind of scary. But wait, this is the one where a lot of parents that I know don't really realize, which is your teen can't legally drive home. In California, an instruction permit's not valid until your teen begins driver training with one of those driving schools. The instructor has to sign the permit to validate it. So your teen should not be driving home right from the DMV, which is super sad and horrible. And hopefully you've already scheduled an instruction, the first instruction time with the instructor. You're going to have to do 6 hours with that instructor. They're 2 hours at a time. So that's why I said, as soon as you make this appointment, hopefully your kid's gonna be, your kid's already passed the test at home, which is the nice thing about that. Hopefully you'll be able to get the appointment also that same day or the next day so they can validate it. So then they can also drive with you. The other thing to know is the permit expires in 1 year. So that was really important for one of my kids because he kind of didn't really want to drive for a while because COVID hit and was not very inspired. And then all of a sudden a friend got a driver's license. And then he realized, oh no, I only have a couple more months of my permit. And I was like, and I don't want to go back to the DMV for you to take that again. So let's work really hard in the next couple of months to make this happen. So we drove everywhere for a couple months and he was able to get his license on the last possible day of that year. Okay. So you've got your permit. So practice. Driving practice. Like I said, 6 hours behind the wheel with a certified instructor and 50 hours of supervised behind the wheel practice. 10 are supposed to be in the dark with a licensed driver over age 25, just like Dr. Ehsani had said. How do you find a driving school? You can ask other parents who've been through it. You can Google, or I asked a lot of parents, and these are the recommended ones that parents I know have used. South Pass Driving School, I thought was going to be like an ace in the hole. They couldn't fit me in for 6 weeks. So we didn't go with them. We ended up going with Chase Driving School. And they were great. They pick you up at home. They drive you around. Do a lot of, it's pretty great. You can definitely request a male or female driver if that's important to you, which I know for many it is. And like I said, many book up early. Okay, pass the wheel, behind the wheel driving test. So where to take the driving test? So the 4 places that people recommended they've taken it is Glendale, Pasadena, El Monte, and Lincoln Park. The 2 closest are probably Lincoln Park and Pasadena. I would hesitate to say they're also the ones I hear are the hardest. I don't have any experience because one of my kids went to El Monte and one went to Glendale. El Monte and Glendale have really easy paths. It's like a square, just driving around the neighborhood there. Lincoln Park, I know, has got all these weird turns and stuff. And Pasadena has this reputation for having really hard graders on the test. So if you really want your kid to make sure they're passing for passing, Pasadena might be the place to go. So anyway, these are the 4 most recommended. One thing also that is really good idea is ask your driving instructor where they recommend. And a lot of driving instructors know the route of one place really well, and they will have your child practice that route with them. That's what they usually ask for them to do on the last driving day that they have with them. Also try and do that last driving day, maybe a week or 2 before you do your driving test, just so you know that your kid has really kind of gone through that last thing. But they can practice the route. And then my kids were able to show me the route. So then we practiced it again a few more times before they actually took the test. And you schedule the test on the California DMV website. So you have an appointment. The bad news is if you fail, you have to wait 2 weeks before retaking the test and pay a retest fee each time. It's just putting this very small. If you fail the test 3 times, you have to reapply again and pay all the applicable fees again. So of course that's not going to happen, but just so you know. Okay, so here's some advice from parents who've been through it. Have your child drive everywhere when they have their driving permit. Driving a lot makes all the difference, just like Dr. Ehsani said, as much as possible. Buy a folder for the glove box that includes registration, insurance card, AAA card if you're a member, and directions on what to do if you get in an accident. Another parent, actually I'm remembering now, made sure she had Post-its and pens. So her kid could write a note on the other person's car to say, I'm so sorry, I just hit your car, here's my phone number. And apparently one of her children used that a lot, unfortunately. And then practice, and a certain amount of encouragement is needed. Just try to be patient, calm, and refrain from demonstrating signs of outward signs of terror. That's hard. It's really hard. Your kid sees it as soon as you just tense up. You know, there might be some arguments, but that's normal. Other things to teach your child that other people recommended is teach them how to pump gas, obviously, unless they have an electric car. Add washer fluid, check or add oil, and check the pressure and change a tire. That actually happened today with one of my kids, and he'd forgotten how to do it, so we had to do it again. Also do a general overview of car features and warning symbols. I realized after my kid had gotten their license, they actually didn't know how to turn on the air conditioning because we'd practice all in cold weather. So that was kind of an interesting one. Insurance. So with my insurance and from what I've heard, usually you don't have to pay for insurance while your kid has a permit, which is kind of amazing. It's really expensive once they get their license, so be ready for that. My insurance company was not very good at being able to tell me how much that was going to cost, which was weird. But you know, you just got to get ready for it. When they go to college, if they take their car, you can, that's supposed to say if they don't take their car, either you can get a reduced rate or sometimes a waiver when they're home for less than 30 days for free. So my insurance company, which is 21st Century, allows for a 30-day waiver 4 times a year, which is really awesome because my kids just came home for Thanksgiving. I got a waiver. They were allowed to drive. And when they come home for Christmas again, I'm allowed to get another 30-day waiver, and I'm not paying a dime, which I'm kind of surprised they do. If your kid does get into an accident, which we've realized it's hard to change insurance companies for 3 years if you want to include them. So we had that happen, and we're on year 2. So we cannot change insurance companies. So we won't be doing that. And I've heard that some insurance companies reduce fees for good student discount, or if you install a dash cam. So all the questions to ask when you're getting their insurance, any discounts you can get are lovely. One last thing I just wanted to add that I just remembered my pediatrician saying, and I think it's one of the best pieces of advice, I wish I'd added it in here, is don't let your child drive under any emotion. And I thought that was really interesting. Of course, you don't want them to drive when they're angry, you know, like go in the car and get in the car and drive when they're angry. You don't want them to drive when they're sad because they might be less likely to drive well. But a friend of mine, an adult, told me a story one time where he was just overly excited about something and he got in the car and got in an accident. And that's exactly what my pediatrician said to one of my kids was, just when you have a big emotion, ask your parents to drive you somewhere, no matter what that big emotion is. And I thought that was great advice. Okay, you've got this. So does your kid. It is over my hour that I normally do, but I'm going to do a few questions and try not to keep us too long because we did go a little over and I'm sorry. Okay, just looking in here. Do you just need to have the driving school sign the document to have your teen drive with you? Meaning, no, you don't have to do the 6 hours first, but you have to do the 2 hours first. So you have to have one driving lesson with them to sign off on it. So not the whole 6. What I recommend for the 6 is do 2 right when they get their permit, 2 kind of halfway through their driving practice, and then 2 maybe a couple weeks before they get their license so that you know the route wherever they're going to take their test and all that. Are there any other questions? Okay, I'm not seeing any. I think wow, we still got so many of you. I want to thank you all so much for coming. I'm so excited it was this many people. It's such important information, and I can't thank you all enough. Dr. Ehsani, I learned so much from you tonight. Corporal Sanchez, I learned so much from you tonight, and I'm clearly going to be a better driver in the next, hopefully forever, because of just all the things you even said. I wish I was even a better driver before. I'm a good driver, but but I want to thank you all so much. And Mr. Eldred, thank you for being here as well and for doing that. And to all you parents, thank you. I am recording this. I am, with the recording, going to send out a document that does have some of the links for the DMV on it, so you can all get to that. So just look out for that. We'll ask Mr. Eldred to send that out in his Friday email. Thank you all so much. Have a good night.